now. So I will begin with an introduction. So today's speaker is Peter Rich. Peter is an assistant professor of policy analysis and management and sociology at Cornell University. I want to start first by thanking Peter for rescheduling this event. He was originally scheduled to visit in December 2019, which was tempting the airline fates, and his flight was canceled in early December 2019. And so I'm very pleased that he was able to come back and rejoin us in the Zoom format this year. So Peter has been at Cornell since receiving his PhD in sociology from NYU in 2016. His research investigates the connections between segregation, inequality, individual choice, and public policy in the United States, asking how sorting processes reflect and reinforce racial and socioeconomic gaps in educational attainment, wealth accumulation, and economic opportunity. As you'll see in his presentation today, his research really is very much at the intersection of sociology, demography, and policy, particularly with a focus on education today. And fitting that, his work has appeared in the journals Demography, American Sociological Review, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Russell Sage Foundation. So I'll turn things over to Peter, and I will ask everybody else to please mute. And again, you can post your questions through chat or by raising your hand. Peter?
All right, thank you, Paula, and thank you so much for having me today. And for those of you, I know Zoom attention can be a little bit difficult, and I appreciate any attention you can give to this project. I'm really excited to present some results today. This work is co-authored with a graduate student at Cornell, Christian Sprague, who is in the engineering department, and he has supercharged this project with his computational skills. And so I really just want to credit him from the outset, and also mention Howen Zhang, who's a sociology PhD student who has provided really helpful graduate assistance work. So for today's talk, I am going to be presenting mostly publicly available data, but behind the scenes, I'll be using some Michigan student administrative data, and a couple results slides will dip into the panel study of income dynamics. So I just want to put out there that whatever we present is ours, and neither of these data sources or the organizations behind them. So let me start by just raising a very well-known challenge, which is that there's unequal access to educational opportunity in the US. And there are so many books and so many articles out there that document this in really clear order. There are big data initiatives, including at Stanford, the Stanford Educational Data Archive, Raj Chetty's workshop, Opportunity Insights, and the Spatial Structures workshop through Brown University. All of these sort of have pulled together a lot of data to document inequality, showing us that children grow up in segregated, unequal contexts. So I'm not going to be able to review this whole literature, and what I'm going to suggest is that what this literature in general concludes is that we have a few policy choices if we want to address segregation and inequality. We could reform low quality schools, and/or we could also address some of the underlying issues in neighborhoods. We could redistribute resources, maybe through finance reform, or we could desegregate schools. And Rucker Johnson has a book called Children of the Dream that really documents the positive effects that integration had in the 70s and 80s, particularly on closing white-black gaps across a host of measures. So that all is there, but the question that I want to ask is, can we change existing policies that are harmful, and what trade-offs do we already accept? So this talk today is going to be about geographic boundaries, districts and catchment areas, and how they lock in inequality. They basically provide teeth to residential segregation. And so what I'm going to eventually show you is that educational boundaries increase the white-black gap in school achievement access by 17% more than residential location alone. There's a lot in there. And so to get us started, I'm going to make some initial clarifications to get us all on the same page. So the overarching question is, how much do educational boundaries exacerbate unequal access to opportunity? By educational boundaries, I'm talking about maps that assign most children to schools based on their home address. These could be catchment area maps within a district, or larger districts also have their own boundaries that determine, based on where you live, where you can attend. And within those, there's some complications. There are school choice policies, transfer policies that blur these lines a little bit. And there's been a proliferation of charter schools, which allow students to attend from various neighborhoods. The other insight here is that many children live close to boundaries that they cannot cross. And I'm going to show you some maps later in this presentation that'll hopefully really sell you on that idea. So access inequality is this next kind of definition I want to clarify, which is that residence for the most part determines access to public schools. And of course, where people live is really stratified by race, socioeconomic status, income, and wealth. That's really well established in the literature. And David Grusky has described this as the commodification of opportunity in the housing market, which I think is a really nice way to describe succinctly what's going on, which is that access to high quality schools are tied to housing prices. So let's talk about opportunity as this third definition. We may all have our own internal idea of what opportunity is, and we're going to be foregrounding test scores in this presentation at the school level. So the average test achievement for schools nationwide, drawing on data provided by Sean Reardon's workshop at Stanford. But we also explore other dimensions of school quality, including test score growth, rather than just the achievement levels, peer composition measured in various ways, per pupil expenditures, and teaching quality. So the typical model we have is that where a child lives sort of determines where they go to school, but there's this intermediary step. So this flow chart kind of gives you a sense of what this project is going to establish, which is that based on where a child lives, they have access to a set of one or more accessible local public schools. Now, I'm a recent parent. I have two young kids, and I have become very aware of the school geography in my area. And it was something I was much less aware of in the past. Now I do have some choice, but I can't really cross over school district boundary lines. And so that may motivate sort of where I choose to live and ultimately where my children go to school. So there are three intermediating processes that affect how we go from block to the set of schools available. So states define district boundaries, and then school districts themselves define catchment areas and kind of manage the schools within them, including opening charters and so forth. And then families themselves are constrained in what they can viably access. So there's commute distance constraints, there's enrollment capacity on the schools that they may want to send their kids to, and there may be transportation constraints. So those things are all kind of determining access, and access is this arrow here that we are particularly interested in today. So of course, there's a dynamic selection component that's happening where families are choosing where to live. Maybe they're not actively choosing it. Maybe they're following some kind of a socially automated process, but they're ending up in neighborhoods that's going to determine the set of schools they can access. And they're also choosing where their kids might go if they have more than one option. And these selection dynamics are sort of working with one another. So it's a bit difficult to disentangle how much this happens, but it's pretty clear that a lot of parents will choose to live in a particular area because they're attentive to school access. Okay, so that's kind of setting the stage. And what we're going to do in this project is see what happens if you turn off the district boundaries and the catchment areas. So now we just have families doing the sorting, but we're going to observe how this access changes. So before and after boundaries are removed. So we ask, how does the school quality access change when removing these boundaries, and what effect do boundaries have on inequality and segregation? So I'm going to take us through a case study of Piedmont Unified in the East Bay of California, and then we'll go into national results and a conclusion. And baked in throughout is a lot of motivating and methodological information. But I do want to note what we're not predicting is how people would respond. So we're not doing the dynamic selection side of this. We're just looking at sort of the consequences of our current boundary arrangement using a counterfactual exercise. So I'm going to start with Piedmont Unified, and then we'll kind of zoom out nationally from there. So Piedmont Unified is this school district right here in the middle of Oakland Unified, which is a much larger citywide school district. And on this map, you have some catchment zones. These are these thin black lines. And then you have these darker lines. These are school district boundaries. So Piedmont is a donut hole in the middle of Oakland. And it has three elementary schools here. These are all traditional schools. And Oakland also has a lot of traditional schools kind of matched to a particular catchment area. And then they've also opened up charter schools. So you can see those pink dots are charter schools. Up here in Berkeley, they have an open enrollment district, and there's an open enrollment school. So what we're going to try to do here is spatially translate for every block, determine the average quality of accessible schools. Now, in some cases, that may seem really easy to do when a catchment zone just has one school in it. But in other areas, there are these schools that kind of float around and can pull students from all over.
I'm just in this talk, hold on.
So access is weighted by the structural probability that a student enrolls in each school. And we're going to estimate these probabilities using a two-sided logit model with statewide student level data in Michigan. So there's a lot packed into that. And I'm not going to go into the details, but what I'm going to say is one way you could take a weighted average is by thinking about the sort of average distance of schools that are accessible, but we're actually trying to really get at the behavior of where do people tend to go based on where they live and the schools that they can access. And we're going to assume that families everywhere respond to constraints similarly to families in Michigan. So since many of you live in Michigan, you're going to be you can tell me if you think you're generalizable or not. But that's something we're going to be testing in the future. Okay, so there are a lot of components that fit into this model when we talk about structural access. This has to do with the boundaries and the catchment areas, different transfer policies, transportation, the type of school, the capacity that the school has to enroll children, and the population density of a given block where somebody might be from, and then the road distance. So the way we've measured this is we've actually taken all 6.2 million blocks in the country and that have people in them. And we've said, what of all the schools in a 25-kilometer radius, what is the road distance that it would take to travel to each of those schools? And we model that as one really big constraint that might affect where you go. And when we estimate these models, we also condition out other types of factors that might also influence where people choose to go. So this now shows these schools on a vector of school quality measured by achievement, where the purple dots here are lower performing schools and the yellow dots are higher performing schools. And so you can see here now that there's a distribution, that there's some spatial clustering of where higher performing schools are and lower performing. And what we're doing in this spatial translation is describing every block according to this. And so the first thing that we're doing is modeling this where all the boundaries are in play. And in some areas, there may be schools competing for attendance from blocks, and that'll be depicted in the data with some gradation, even within a particular zone. But the really exciting thing that we're going to be doing here is looking at what happens when the boundaries come off. So this is Piedmont Unified, as I mentioned. It is a very high income area. In addition to the sort of state and federal dollars, they raise an additional $9 million a year that goes to their three elementary, I think 1 or 2 middle and 1 high school. And the community there is very affluent, and they contribute to the schools here with a lot of additional arts programming. So these are things that students who are outside of Piedmont are virtually unable to access. So here's the counterfactual in action. So this is a smoothing process that our weighting function has basically evaluated, where the lines are now able to be crossed. And I want to just kind of focus your attention on what happens in these two boxes. On the left side, this is where boundaries are uncrossable for the most part. And on the right side, where there's virtually no boundaries and families are still operating under constraints. So everything's not just one color, distance is still playing a role, but there's a dramatic improvement here in the kinds of schools that kids in this part of Oakland can access. Okay, so the model is so specific that it's even picking up the topography of Piedmont. This is a really hilly area, and so you can see some gradation even in who's up at the top of the hill and what school they're most likely to access versus those further down. And a really important component here is that the boundary is going to affect populations at the margins, but not populations down in other parts. This is in East Oakland and Fruitvale area. And they're virtually unaffected because they're deep within the Oakland Unified School District. But turning off catchment boundaries still does smooth things a little bit as well. So we've turned off both in this map. Okay, so I'm throwing a lot at you, and I just want to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions that have been emerging, or if anybody has any clarification questions. There's a lot to go in here, and I'm going to jump to national results, but I thought at least I want to pause for a moment.
Okay. Looks like we're on the same page.
Okay, I will take that. Good. Okay, so before getting into those national results, I want to raise some normative and practical concerns. So the argument ultimately being made here is that educational boundaries create these sort of fiefdoms of privilege with high housing entry costs. And although I'm not going to show it here, I've looked at sort of how tracked home values sort of correlate, and they do strongly with achievement access. But boundaries are unmeritocratic in the sense that by tying family resources to school access, it kind of flies in the face of at least to the dream of a meritocratic equal opportunity society. And so their removal would be radically redistributive. And so I'm really clear about that, that people in Piedmont would be really upset about this kind of a policy change of suddenly this boundary that they've sorted towards. They may have bought into that particular residential area, knowing that it would give them that access. And so removing these boundaries, it would be very radical. So it's not going to get a lot of political traction. Why would we even consider this? So the first thing I do want to say is that it is technically possible. So Milliken v. Bradley is a Supreme Court decision which said school districts can't impose busing programs on neighboring school districts, but state legislators do have a lot of power. So they can consolidate districts or they can open transfer policies. And in California, actually, there is an open transfer policy in place. And that's actually in that model, the one on the left. It's just highly restrictive. Districts have to agree, partnering districts have to agree if a student wants to transfer, and there are capacity constraints that limit who gets to go, and sort of priority goes to the resident student. So in an oversubscribed, very attractive schooling area like in Piedmont Unified, the chance that a kid from the outside the border in Oakland gets to attend is very low. Now in Michigan, there are also open transfer policies, and they also have some friction to them, and uptake is not, it's not extremely high. It tends to be most often for kids in central city school districts out at the edges. Okay, so it's politically unlikely. There's a This American Life that really documents this in St. Louis when suburban white parents really fought back against an integration program sending kids from the Normandy school district into their area. It's a great podcast. It's work done by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I really recommend it. But I still think we should consider that the way this cost is currently borne, it goes through marginalized populations. So this picture was taken by a friend in the Bay Area who was walking past one of the elementary schools in Piedmont, and he knew about my project, and he took this picture during sort of COVID times. Our struggles are connected. And I think that that's a really appropriate sign for more reasons than maybe they imagined, which is that the affluence and the privilege enjoyed in Piedmont is very much connected to what's happening in Oakland and what populations there are enduring. And it's also rhetorically important. So this is where I really want to hammer home that we are in this era of school choice market ideology. And boundary removal is really going to force this logic to an extreme. So rhetorically, that's valuable because housing investments are really tied to state regulation of school access. That's not the only thing, but that's a big part. And so what kind of free choice is tolerable and for whom? I'm hoping to provoke a really serious debate about trade-offs there because free choice that allows kids to sort within a low-income segregated school district and compete for charter school enrollment is very different than opening access in ways that are tangible. Okay, so there are a lot of data that go into this project, and I'm not going to be able to summarize this all and still get to some interesting results. So I do want to just highlight a few things here, which first we're sort of covering a lot of grounds on geography, including incorporating catchment areas and doing this road distance calculation. I mentioned my co-author Christian. He has figured out how to do this in a parallel environment. We have billions of observations that have gone into figuring out exactly how far people go. We're not using aerial distance to measure constraints. And we're doing this nationally. We're also working with Sean Reardon, and his whole team has a really comprehensive data set nationally of school level achievement, and it's pooled from 2009 to 16. So we're describing everything in this 2016 framework, but we're using data that have been pooled across a lot of years to try to eliminate noise when we talk about a school's test achievement level. And we're also incorporating detailed state level transfer policies. So I mentioned Michigan and California. As I'll show later, a lot of states have variation in how much friction and whether they allow any kind of transfer at all within or between school districts. And then there's some variation even at the school district level. And Sal Saporito and his team have done a lot of work with the Sabins system. And they have a 350 school district database where they outline the policy for every single one of them. So we've incorporated as much information as we can. And then those weighting models are based on student level data from Michigan. And so we use fourth graders. And what we're basically doing is taking the model and developing a weighting system that can be applied to public data. And then using that public data to look at everything nationally and analyze things from an inequality framework, looking at population counts, and also using the panel study of income dynamics, using the restricted block geocode. Okay, so I mentioned policy counterfactuals. I promise results are coming up soon. So there are sort of two dimensions of transfer policy: attending schools outside of your own district, and then attending schools outside of a catchment area within your own district. And there's actually quite a bit of variation. Importantly for us, Michigan is right in the middle. And I've done this sort of coarse coding of saying it's either unsupported, there's limited support, meaning you can do it, but there are a lot of bureaucratic constraints and districts have to agree. So we might think about this as kind of a friction-riddled way of transferring between districts or schools. And then open would be just sort of truly open. And these cases here of open inter-district enrollment, this is based on a data set, but I actually think we're being a little too nice in assuming there's no friction here, but that's to kind of downweight the size of our estimates. You'll note that like Washington, DC does not have inter-district enrollment because that would require it going beyond the state. And so there's no way for it to do that. But we're actually going to include removal of state boundaries as well as part of the counterfactual exercise. So we're gonna see where we're gonna observe each place based on its true policy context. So California was right in here where Piedmont is. But we're then going to look at what happens when we move to a sort of totally open environment. And we can just tweak our prediction model in how we develop our weights by changing which schools are in the considerations set and whether there's a transfer friction happening. So I want you to imagine where you live. There may be a set of schools nearby, and they are within a boundary. And if we remove that boundary and suddenly you have an open world to choose from, you're of course still going to be constrained. So if all schools within 25 kilometers of you, that's a huge choice set. But almost all of them are going to have very tiny weights to them because they're too far away to even consider. And the ones that are closest to you will still matter the most. But now boundaries are not going to artificially constrain that. For those of you who are familiar with a lot of the spatial demography terminology, this is basically a modifiable areal unit problem where the boundaries themselves are kind of disfigured and create discontinuities in what we otherwise might have from a smooth residential context. But the difference here is these are socially meaningful boundaries. They're not artificial in the sense that they have real consequences. Okay, so we measure school quality access nationally. Everywhere coverage is good except Colorado because of the Rockies. And then we even have Alaska and Hawaii. They didn't make it on the map. There are a few blotchy areas, but for the most part, we have full national population-wide coverage based on where people live according to their block. So I'm gonna show you Michigan now. And in part because I'm giving this talk to Michigan virtually, but also it provides a really nice case study. If you look at this zoomed in window, we have the Detroit public schools here, and then we have Grosse Pointe. And there is a little bit of blending across the border because it is possible for some kids to sort of move between districts. Now, this isn't estimated now with individual data. This is really estimated using our sort of public weighting model. So the same thing we've used everywhere, we're using it here. So whether this picks up a little bit of air or not, you may know more than me, people who are local to this area. But the important thing for our purposes is what happens if we were to remove those boundaries, how that smoothing occurs, and who benefits from it. So inland, further into Detroit, there's not necessarily a huge dividend to be paid, but along these bordering areas, there's a big difference in the school quality. And this is removing that sort of transfer friction coefficient in our model. So I'll show you also in Chicago. So Chicago is another sort of well-known case of widespread segregation. Here's the south side of Chicago here. Chicago is a large district, and in this zoomed in window, this is an area called Oak Park that's its own school district, and it's affluent. Living across the boundary makes a huge difference. Literally, like the going from the lowest, these are 20 quantile bins, from going from the lowest to the top. And when we smooth those borders, what happens is two things. One is these bordering areas receive the benefits of being near some of those high-performing schools. But internally, the sort of hoarded opportunity is being distributed outwardly a little bit. And so this goes down. So it's redistributive truly in the sense that there's some loss for Oak Park residents and a gain for Chicago residents. Okay, so let me pause again for questions. I know we go to about 35 minutes. I'm going to show you some more stuff. But if anybody has any questions right now or is worried normatively about the exercise that we're doing. Okay, I'm not seeing anything pop up, so I'm going to keep going here. And you could imagine that there are many dimensions of inequality to think about. Now considering where people live in these neighborhoods. So far we haven't populated the data really. And So we're going to think about dimensions of inequality and then various school characteristics. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus on white-black gaps and using census block data for the most part. I'll show a little bit from the PSID. And then thinking mostly about mean test achievement, which is what what I've shown so far, but also looking at test growth and percent white. Okay, so the white-black gap in school achievement access, this is estimated nationally. The standard errors on this are tiny. And so these are all significant, some of the comparisons that I'm gonna walk through. But we have a current gap here. In the case of white-black mean school achievement, the gap is 0.42 standard deviations. And when we remove just catchment areas within districts, that goes down by about 5%. So that goes down, it's not a huge change. When we remove districts, just sort of completely what I was showing in the maps, it goes down much more. So it's a 14.5% reduction in the white-black mean school achievement access gap. And alternatively, a way to think about this is that what the boundaries currently do is this is the residential level, 0.364, and the boundaries are actually exacerbating the school access gap by 17% more than what we would expect just on residential location. So to put this in a scale that's interpretable, this is equivalent to peers having about 1.67 more months of classroom instruction in a year. So a way to think about that would be if white and black children are both attending schools, but the black children are attending schools where their peers are released a month, almost 2 months before at the white school. That's like one conceptual way to think about it. That's a pretty big gap in access. This is not predicting enrollment. So of course, families may choose many different ways in terms of what school they actually go to, but this just picks up that access gap. So when we look at it for growth, we actually see a similar trend. So this is school achievement growth in test scores. Now the scale on this is a lot smaller. So we still see this effect going down by, in this case, like a 17% reduction. And alternatively, another way to think about this is that the boundaries are exacerbating the residential gap alone by about 21%. So those boundaries, especially school district boundaries, are playing this inequality generating role on top of where people currently live. Now I want to sprinkle in again that we're kind of thinking about this in a static equilibrium sense. This is just if we change things right now, and of course people would respond. And so we're not saying that this would completely change inequality, but it does reveal what those boundaries do and how people sort according to those. But one quick note about this is that the scale of growth is very compressed because this measures sort of what a school does over time, netting out the sort of incoming peer achievement level. So this gap is not quite as big. It's about 1.25 months of instruction over a 5-year period. And there's a running debate over whether schools matter and how this all plays out. So this is sort of a nod to that literature. I'm going to skip past the punchline on segregation, and is that there's about 10% more segregation in school access than residential location alone would predict. And we didn't just look at race. We also looked at various dimensions of socioeconomic status using the PSID. And so these plots show the gaps predicted within the PSID sort of in the current context. And then if we remove catchments and then open up all boundaries, as we might expect, when weighted with appropriate sample weights, the PSID is very similar to what we see nationally in terms of the white-black gap. The standard errors here are big, though, because it's a smaller sample. And when we look at non-poor versus poor, we see a similar pattern. This is the top 2 quintiles of income versus the bottom 3. This is wealth above median positive wealth versus below median and 0 wealth and those in debt. I'm happy to talk about that stuff in the Q&A, but you basically see this same kind of gradient as we'd expect. So we also get a lot of variation in different areas. So turns out that Chicago is not on the list here of metro areas, nor is the Oakland Piedmont area in terms of how big of a change we would see with from these boundaries. Cleveland is the big winner, and I'm going to just skip ahead to a map of Cleveland to show you what happens. Here we have Shaker Heights right outside of the city of Cleveland, and when you run the counterfactual, a lot of children within Cleveland gain access. So some districts have really big effects, notably Oakland and Atlanta, Houston as well, Baltimore, Dallas, and Portland. These are all sort of larger school districts where catchments play a big role internally. And so here's the Atlanta story. Again, you see some more smoothing. So I'm running out of time. So what I just want to conclude by saying is that nationwide, what we're seeing is that these boundaries increase the mean white-black gap in school achievement by 17% more than residential location alone. And although I didn't show it, we find similar proportional effects for other measures of school quality, like peer free and reduced lunch composition, teaching quality, but we don't find it for per pupil expenditures because there's been a lot of finance reform that where states sort of redistribute expenditures. So this is too much for one talk, so I'm not even showing you a whole bunch of stuff. And we have additional research topics, including we have Zillow data that we're going to be tying house prices to and doing some boundary discontinuity work. And there are some underlying methodological improvements that we're working on here. But again, it's too much for one talk. So let me just conclude by saying, I started us off by suggesting that we have this challenge of unequal access to educational opportunity. But right beneath our noses, we have a politically implausible but very important mechanism here. But does that mean we should dissolve all educational boundaries? So I'm not going to make that case here. William Fischel has a great book about the sort of economic history of school districts. And the truth is there would be a lot of blowback if we were to do that. Sorry, this is the slide I meant to have. There would be a lot of blowback if we did that. And we may actually lose tax revenue investment and people may move. There could be a lot of moving parts, but there could be some creative solutions, including lottery-based opportunity programs that sort of do this at a scale, maybe 10, 15% of kids. Removing the transfer friction, maybe doing a little bit more progressive school finance reform, working on housing integration. And because I'm a sociologist, I just want to say that maybe we should be weakening the consequences of educational stratification so that the stakes are not so high in the first place of where you live and what kinds of schools you can access. If we have a more robust safety net, then maybe the problem I've described here would not have quite the same teeth. So just to close, I want to say that these boundaries are fundamentally unmeritocratic because they exacerbate unequal education access, and they do embody this historical inertia of segregation and stratification that I had to gloss over quickly. People really kind of accept them when they choose where to live because what other choice do you have? This is not about bad actors in the housing market. It's about the market itself being warped by the boundaries. And overall, this contributes to this commodification of opportunity. So the one book I didn't have on the slide earlier is Charles Tilley's Durable Inequality, and I think that's really fitting here because this is a spatial case of opportunity hoarding. So some people will argue that local community control is really important, and I don't disagree, but I think that should be weighed against these material and social costs that are borne by marginalized populations. So I will end there. Really happy to take questions.
That was great, Peter. Thank you so much. Do we have questions for Peter?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you run these counterfactuals.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Let's go back just a little bit. I'm just gonna take us back in the slides. There's a lot of slides. Hang on. Okay, so so what we've actually done is we've taken a model that you can think of as having coefficients for various factors like distance and whether a boundary needs to be crossed to get from a block to a particular school. There are capacity constraints. All of these are estimated in a two-sided logit model, and we have parameters that that we've sort of extracted, and we're using that to generate predicted probabilities. And we actually do it for all 9 of these scenarios for every single block in the country, where we say, okay, if you're in a completely constrained environment, then you are unable to go outside of your catchment zone. And so that will then determine that the only school you can access is the one that's in your catchment zone. In the sort of limited environment, you can go to any schools within your district, but they are going to have friction associated with them. And that those friction parameters that mean people are less likely to cross a boundary in an unopen sort of environment. So the sort of set of options expands whenever we go from this unsupported to limited in either direction. So that's how we change which schools are in the consideration set. And then we sort of turn on and off the transfer friction coefficient when we go from limited to open. So specifically what we do is we treat all schools as if they're in a common district, and therefore there's no crossing of a boundary. And so that effectively allows us to see what would happen if there wasn't that friction. And so we do this 9 times, and we actually have a 10th where we turn off state boundaries as well. Because there are some metro areas where there's, they're on the border of a state. So that's the sort of general framework. And then we model the true conditions based on, this is showing states, but we actually have it at the district level, what their policy environment is. So that's the true policy environment. So in Michigan, for instance, we're in this here. And so we compare this true environment to this open environment. And that's where we're drawing those 2 maps.
Thanks, Peter. We have a question that's come through the chat from Bob Shaney. Do you want to take that regarding whether you've included private schools and how their inclusion might affect your results?
Oh yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So of course, this is one of the ways that families might operationalize their choices. We intentionally left out private schools from this because we're really thinking about public school access as this public good. And we're thinking about the ways boundaries are sort of warping that. So private schools don't operate with any kind of geographic boundaries. And you could imagine adding private schools into the mix of options. And those would have distance constraints, and they may also have tuition related constraints. And so, so as we've been thinking about this, one approach we could do to try to update the effects is think about different tracks we have data on how many kids go to private versus public school. And so we could incorporate that in to try to get a bound on the estimate of who would actually go. But at this point, we're trying to just focus on public schools as this sort of public good that is tied to residential location.
Okay, anything more?
Oh, I have a question.
Yep.
So a few slides ago, you mentioned this distinction between access and actual enrollment rates after boundaries were hypothetically changed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you wrote it out, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on what kind of barriers to school choice might still exist after removing those boundaries, like in terms of like making the actual call to switch your kid to a different school, or whether you even know that your choices have changed. And also then, so how many parents might actually choose different schools if they had the choice and were aware of it?
Yeah, this is, thank you for your question. So there is this complication here, which is that we don't know exactly what parents would do in a shifting environment. I've done some work on how families respond when information about the quality of their school is sort of updated, and have found that families will move if they, or will sort of seek out an alternative school if they get a signal that the school their kid is going to is really low performing. So families may sort of adjust, and they may not know what is in their current consideration set, and then what would happen if suddenly this changed. So there's an information component that we haven't tapped into at all. That's why we're kind of focusing on this access question, because the constraints that determine sort of going from having a set of schools to choosing where a child actually goes, that is fraught with a whole bunch of difficult questions about individual family preferences, the knowledge that they have, and the sort of like heuristic devices that they might use to assess school quality. And actually Elizabeth Brooke has done some, I'm sure a lot of you know, some really cool work on this about how people make decisions to choose different contexts. And this is an example where that would be really complicated. So we're focusing on access strategically because we can't really address how this would change actual enrollment in schools. And so I'm punting on the question in part because there are so many complicated factors that go into this sort of final leg. But I will note that what I've found in other work is that, for example, opening up more schools has led in some cases to an increase of school segregation. For instance, the expansion of charter schools in districts across the country over the 2000s has led to an increase in school segregation, particularly white-black segregation, and a very mild, modest decline in residential segregation at the same time. So I'm citing my own paper that actually came out online in Demography today, that is sort of looking at that along with Jen Candipin and Ann Owens, that looks at that dynamic. But the idea here is that these are sort of pulling on each other in complicated ways. And we're just really trying to isolate this boundary effect here. So sorry to punt, but it's theoretically sound punting, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your presentation. It was really great.
Thank you.
Well, Peter, I have a question for you, and it's about local inequality. So you gave us some, I think, really clear examples of highly unequal areas, Piedmont compared to Oakland and Oak Park compared to the rest of Chicago. And you showed us the average effect of removing boundaries on children's school access to schools with higher or lower test scores. But what's sort of the spread of the variation and the impact of this? And would it be greatest in high inequality areas as compared to low inequality areas? And how do you think about if this were a policy that were going to be implemented, if you're going to propose changes to the way boundaries are handled, where would you have the biggest impact, and where do you think you might have the most plausible impact in terms of thinking about local inequality between districts?
Yeah, thank you, Paula, for that question. That's I don't think it would be a one-size-fits-all policy by any means. And this question about the distribution is really important because, as you know, the mean can obscure a lot of variation. That was built into your question. And so what we have here is the distributional plot. This is of the sort of true condition, not the counterfactual. You see that the means are reported over here, but you can see a pretty wide spread. And there are actually, in some cases, white students who would really benefit from boundary removal as well. There are cases where there are Black children who would be hurt by boundary removal. And so it's not, it's, you know, the mean will obscure a lot. And one of the ways we're thinking about going with this is doing some, you know, like a Thiel's index and sort of decomposing it between groups under these different conditions as a way to think about how the inequality is distributed. Anyway, so I'm thinking about it. So that one part of your question is about that variation. And the other is about the sort of like hyper locality. So I put up a couple of these cases where you have, sorry to flip around so much, where you have these metro areas where there's a lot of variation. So Cleveland is one, Detroit is down here, but there are some areas where there's actually no difference at all. And that may be because there's a strong desegregation policy still in place in a very large district. And so one of the sort of offshoots of this project is to ask what predicts the likelihood of a metro area or an individual district having a large boundary effect. Is it sort of the history of how those boundaries were formed, the population inequality within them? Is there a funding formula that makes differences between schools? There are these moving parts that we're really trying to think through. So I haven't made specific policy recommendations, but the power of doing this is we can actually estimate at a very micro level where these contrasts are the most extreme, and then we can think about targeted opportunity programs in those places. And one other thing I'd like to say on that too is that, you know, I use Piedmont. It's not really a straw man. That's a real condition, and it's a real situation. And there is that sign up that says, like, you know, our destinies are connected, and I think that that's a really important point, is that there's a rhetoric around, often in sort of like affluent communities, there's a rhetoric of being aware of privilege, but then living in an extremely exclusive place. And so part of the goal too is to quantify what are the dividends of living in those exclusive places, and to push people to think about, well, how much are they willing to give up in a tangible way? It may not be anything at all, but at least that needs to be reckoned with.
Great, thank you. And we had one more question come through the chat, and I think we'll take this as our last question before going on to our professional development conversation. So you had a question about how you'll use the Zillow data on home prices to integrate that with this work.
Yes, so I mentioned that, thank you for this question. I mentioned that Christian, who is the co-author on here, he is a computational whiz, and what he is doing is building a boundary discontinuity design for us to analyze this, where you can look at homes, individual homes. We have national data on sales prices sort of quarterly going back. And so you can look at homes that are on either side of a boundary and compare them on similar properties, and sort of make this assumption in a boundary discontinuity design that those two homes are virtually identical. They're in close to the same neighborhood. They may be across the street from one another. They're close to identical except for the school access dimension. And so in a boundary discontinuity framework, this is like economists call this hedonics designs. They'll do an analysis and try to figure out the educational difference. How much are people paying extra in home prices to sort of gain access to that difference in that educational dimension? And so what we can do with this is we've measured this in a hyper-local way that really takes into account the complex school choice nature going on. And so we can get at that difference at a very sort of precise level, just using the true estimates, not even using the counterfactual method. And from there, we can get this price differential and average it over a market. So let's say all of Atlanta, we get a sense of what's the price elasticity for school achievement, for school growth, for all sorts of ways of measuring schools, and kind of see what people tend to pay for more. But then we can also look at how that varies across markets. So there's a big generalizing assumption in a lot of the hedonics literature, which is that hey, we've got great data on this one spot, and so let's look at what's happening in this one spot and then sort of generalize out from there. And what we're trying to do is measure these price elasticities market by market, and then see what predicts it. So you'd think that some things that predicted are how fractured the boundaries are. So whether we have one big consolidated district in an area or lots of small ones, just how much income inequality there is in an area would be another big factor, and then the distribution of school quality as well. Those are just a few. That's something I'm really curious to explore pretty soon here. So I think that was the last question. So of the sort of substantive talk. So I really appreciate people's attention, and you know, I'd welcome emails about this. This is our first time really presenting these results outwardly, and you know, I'm pretty excited about them. I think that those maps tell an interesting story and push on some big sociological threads, or pull on some big threads. But you know, we're always looking for more feedback and comments. So I'd welcome those if you want to email me. I'd really appreciate it. And thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Peter. And I hope our PSC postdoc and pre-doc trainees will stay on for a discussion.
All right. And I'm going to stop the share on my screen now, if that's okay.
Well, thanks, Peter. That was, it really was terrific, and it was just such an impressive collection of data and great application. So as I mentioned over email, this is our group of pre-doc and postdoc trainees. Our pre-docs are from sociology, health behavior and health education in the public health school, economics, public policy, and social work. And our postdocs are also drawn from those disciplines. So I'd like to just open the floor to you to direct questions to Peter as you wish.
I have a question. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really interesting. And it's kind of related, you kind of touched on this with your response to Ellie's question, but I guess with research on schools, like school policy and education policy varies so much from state to state. And I was wondering how you kind of approach questions about education inequality from like a generalizability sense. Like how do you kind of position that work strategically to be interesting to like sociologists and demographers who tend to focus on like more national studies?
Yeah, thanks for this question. It is a real tension because, you know, when we're thinking about sociological ideas, what I think we really care about are these big, you know, sweeping ideas. Like I'm trying to push on redistribution here, you know, and like really push this sort of history of racial inequality, like sort of living in the boundaries. And the way I've approached it on this project is to try to measure with as much local specificity as possible. And I don't think that's a sustainable approach. This has taken an enormous amount of work and time, and you know, I keep plugging my co-author. He has done a lot of the heavy lifting here, and so you know, so that's hard. So the question though is maybe trying to think about what is this a case of is a way of thinking about it. So Piedmont, if all I had were data just on that Piedmont Oakland scenario, I think that would still provide a very interesting paper about sort of this sort of case study of opportunity hoarding. But it wouldn't get us to that national question. And that tension between the two, you're right, it's really hard to get at. And so I think that one thing you can try to do though is think about when you ask what is this a case of, then that gets you to generalizable ideas, even if you can't report on the scale of an issue or sort of like you won't necessarily be able to say that this means we know that if it's 15% in this area, we know it is nationally, but you can say, hey, this is going on. And then that sort of provokes the bigger question. The last thing I'm going to say about this is that eventually what we hope to do is produce all these maps and have like a way for people to interact and create a way so that if we're getting the policy wrong in a particular area, we could kind of crowdsource that, and then we'll have our main results, but then maybe we'll have a sort of like updating results as we get more information and engagement. Because that's the other scary thing is like, you think you've covered everything, and then somebody's gonna say, well, that's not how school transfers work in this part of Detroit or whatever, and suddenly it gets tricky. So.
I got a question that I'm trying to make more general because I am substantive interest in schools and residential segregation as well. But I was thinking about what you were talked about in your talk with kind of the idea that there's unintended consequences. So you say like, if we, removed all these boundaries, then this is the access that we would see. But, if we actually did that, there would be all kind of innumerable unintended consequences. And I think about that a lot in the same kind of domain, but I also think that's probably much more relevant to the, varied work I know that's represented here. So like, how do we think about that as sociologists and other fields when we're thinking about, work that obviously can impact policy, but that maybe could have something that we totally didn't intend it to have. So what are your thoughts on that was kind of my question.
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you. I think about this as well. I have dissertation work that's not published yet. It's like taken forever, but it's about desegregation and the history of it and how it influenced white flight, and sort of thinking more about this. So there are a couple of things. One is just at a base level. Sometimes we worry a lot about sort of people moving away in response to a big policy. And that actually is a little bit overblown because it is really disruptive to move away from somewhere because you don't like how a policy has changed. And, so that's one quick thing. The idea that people will quickly vote with their feet is a little overstated, but that doesn't mean these consequences can't happen. And so on a sort of practical level, I think that it is useful to consider the sort of a range of options and degrees of options that you could consider, and then try to think about what is the amount of an intervention you could have that might produce some valuable change without completely leading to some sort of dramatic falling out. So there's a decision analytics science in the systems engineering field, which I'm like starting to learn about, that my co-author is a PhD student in. And what they'll do is actually kind of model what the effects would be under like all of the potential options, and then think about what would optimize different trade-offs. And that leads into the third question, or the third part of my answer, which is that we currently pay these trade-offs, but we pay them in a way where marginalized populations are absorbing them. And I've shown like white-black differences. And, so there's an inertia to the policies as they've been written. And in this current phase where we're in ostensibly race-neutral territory, it would, like if we take that truthfully, then we can't, because there's a whole racist history that explains why people live in which neighborhoods they do, and even how some of these boundaries were formed. And so the inertia to say this would be a radical policy, that's one standpoint. Another standpoint would be to say we're actually continuously under a radical policy that is extracting opportunity and wealth from, in this case, Black communities, and reconcentrating it to white communities. And so to kind of flip the question and say, okay, yes, there may be unintended consequences does that mean that the current consequences are intended? You know, and if so, like why? Let's really push hard on that, rather than just kind of accepting the current policy frame as inevitable. And so I know I'm being long-winded, but I wanted to recommend to you, Michelle Jackson has a book kind of pushing for big ideas about policy change. And she has a little article in the Stanford policy newsletter. I forget what it's called, but it's called like, don't let policy type A policies crowd out type B policies. So we have this tendency in the policy world to think about incremental changes in a very narrow scope that doesn't address the fundamental underlying problems. And so this would argue, you know, actually we need to go big and see what comes out when we do.
I have a question. Could you speak a little bit more to sort of like what the Michigan part, what you're using the Michigan data for? I work very closely like with the Michigan student level data here, and I'm doing some work on this in my own dissertation on sort of funding inequality. And it sort of seemed like you were just using this more as like for the weighting matrix and not like specific to Michigan. Yeah,
thank you. So I got into the Michigan data. Actually, I work with Kathy Mitchell-Moore, who's great. She's a co-author with me, and we have a paper that's looking at sort of family, school, and neighborhood contextual long-term context contributing to white-black gaps in educational outcomes. And so those data that we have are block level, and also, of course, you know everything about the school. But over time, you can look at how students' contexts have varied over time. So I've been working on that for a while. We have a paper that's under review right now, just kind of trying to think through what the next step is. And independently, I was working on this other project and thought, you know what, if we were to just model school choice in that Michigan environment, we could do so much better than most spatial weighting, which is to like assume that there's some distance function, 1 over distance squared or cubed, and you know, you introduce all these assumptions, and we were like, well, let's just model it, and we can actually even control for preferences as well, and just kind of get at these distance parameters in a really clear way. So that's the way we did it, and I applied and was recently approved, luckily, to extend our research questions into asking these questions. I purposely didn't present the models because I didn't. You have to give them a 30-day window, and so I just sort of talk about it. but that's how it's working. I'm happy to talk more about those data. It's pretty great that they're allowing access, and we're trying to be thoughtful about how to use it.
Great. Yeah, I might follow up with an email later. Thank you.
I had a question, and thank you for your talk. So you discussed the differences between Blacks and whites, but I was curious if you had any idea around like what the heterogeneity within groups might look like, because I was looking at the Atlanta citywide, and as you know, like communities vary, and so I was just interested in your thoughts on like heterogeneity and where that might land like in this story.
Yeah, thank you. So when I estimate with block level data, this is like one of those classic problems where like demographers are limited by like whatever measures we have. And so at the block level, I have race by age counts. And in fact, when I get really low from the census, the racial categories are very coarse, and they don't even break out for Black children. You can't break out non-Hispanic from Hispanic Black children. So that's already a problem. If I move up to the tract level, I can start to get a lot more population heterogeneity. But I lose that geographic specificity because sometimes a tract gets cut in half by a boundary or something. So the way I've done this is to sort of aggregate up from blocks just in general so that I can describe for a tract, here's what the average kid in this tract, the kind of access they have. And then I can put all sorts of more detailed information. So I hadn't thought about variation within racial group. I mean, of course, the like Hispanic, non-Hispanic difference is like a major one. But I haven't thought about that, but of course I need to, because when we describe these access gaps, we may be missing like a really important part of the story. And I should say too that I'm using a common frame, this mean achievement gap kind of thing, just to try to give. We're doing so much other stuff in this, to just try to give something someone to like latch onto. And you can imagine that there are a lot of projects that could come out from this. But I will say, the other thing is we have thought about intersectionality in the PSID. So I didn't show it, but I can't get a lot of race heterogeneity in the PSID, but we did a decomposition where we look at basically like how much of the access gap, the white-black access gap, can be explained by group differences in socioeconomic variables like income, wealth, all these kinds of things. And then how does that change when we like remove the boundaries? And what we find is that the sort of like white advantage over black in access, when you remove the boundaries, socioeconomic variables matter less. So suddenly, because that's like what explains some of the sorting, and so we're starting to get there, but there's a lot more to do for sure. Thanks for that question.
So that brings us up to our ending time. So Peter, you were offered to take emails from some of our participants. So if you're more generally open to that, I would encourage all of you to follow up with Peter as you're interested. So thank you for a really fantastic presentation and a follow-up conversation. It's just, again, a really, I think it's impressed about a collection of data, as I said, a really interesting set of questions. And I think it just spoke to such a variety of disciplines and perspectives in demography. So I really appreciate you presenting something of such broad appeal and interest.
Thank you. Thanks for being for entertaining this, because this forced us to try to get the message really clear. And so it's been really fun to work on the presentation, but I really am, I'm like thirsty for feedback because it's like so big and so new. So I really would welcome your emails and yeah, just thank you again, Paula. I really appreciate the invitation.
Sure thing. Okay. Well, thanks to all of you for coming. Good seeing you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.